We are very excited to have you all here today celebrating our 10th webinar of the year. Today's webinar is entitled Increasing Resilience and Compliance with ISO Management System Standards. We're going to be talking about how to increase the resilience of your organization using ISO Management System Standards as well as some other guidelines. We're very happy today to have two speakers actually with us. We have Michael Johnson. He has more than 35 years of experience, so he must be at least 40 years old, in the security field. Mike is an expert in the ISO frameworks, particularly ISO 27001, and he founded Resilium under its former name Security GRC Squared in 2006. Over the course of his career as a security professional, Mike has been involved in over 75 information security, business continuity, and risk management related projects, and has overseen more than 250 management system audits. He holds a BA Masters of Information Assurance from Norwich University and a MBA from Northeastern University. We also have with us today Michael Jennings. Mike has more than 26 years of business continuity management system and risk management experience and has worked extensively with clients globally on their BCM programs. During his career, Mike has held executive level management and consulting roles, as well as leading the business continuity and disaster readiness executive for a large health insurance plan in New England. He is an adjunct professor at Boston University teaching BCM and ERM at a master's level and is a founding member of Continuity Insights magazine's editorial advisory board. He holds a BA from Norwich University and a master's degree in business continuity, risk management, and security from Boston University. We have two webinar objectives today. We're going to show you how management system standards can be used to enhance, sustain, and improve organizational resilience. We're also going to show you how management system standards can be used to demonstrate compliance to the EU General Data Protection Regulation, as well as the New York State Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirements. If you have questions during the webinar today, please use the questions button. If we're not able to get to your questions at the end of the webinar, Michael or Mike will follow up with you individually. So we'd like to start by taking our first poll. The question is, how many of you have worked with management system standards in the past? So this is an opportunity for you to get involved in the poll. So you should be able to answer yes, no, or you're not sure. We'll give it another 5 seconds or so. All right, so let's go ahead and share the results. We have 57% of the people attending have worked with management system standards in the past, 10% have not, and 33% are not sure. So with that, I'm going to hand the controls over to Michael.
Okay, Linda, thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Johnson here with Mike Jennings. Let me just get the slideshow started. Bear with me 1 second, please. All right, are you able to see my screen? It looks like it's displaying. Linda, are you able to see it?
We can, yes. Go ahead and put it in presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, terrific. So thank you for the introduction. Appreciate everyone taking the time to spend a little time with us and talking about using management system standards to enhance organizational resilience and demonstrate compliance. What we'll walk you through, first of all, is some background on ISO, talk about quickly two management system standards, 27001 and 22301, then show some mappings as to how the management system standards can be integrated and also mapped against the ICOR organizational resilience framework, and then talk about demonstrating regulatory compliance, specifically focusing on EU GDPR. I mean, the enforcement date for that is the 25th of May 2018, and then also New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirements that, depending on what field you're in as a covered entity or a third party, compliance may become an issue for you February, March of next year. So based upon the poll results, the first part of the presentation I'll move through relatively quickly, in that I believe it was 57% of the attendees had worked with management system standards. So I'll just talk briefly about what ISO is. It's the International Organization for Standardization. It's made up of 162 national standards bodies. The standards body in this country, ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, is basically a non-governmental agency that participates as part of ISO with various technical committees to come up with relevant standards. I believe down the bottom of this slide, ISO has published almost 22,000 standards that cover a wide range of disciplines, trying to get the world to align around standardization around products, goods, services, and other things. A management system, there's a definition here that I got from ISO. A management system is the way in which an organization manages the interrelated parts of the business in order to achieve its objectives. Objectives can be related to a number of different topics, including products or service quality, operational efficiency, environmental performance, and certainly for our purposes, information security and business continuity, as it helps define and enhance organizational resilience. So just quickly, a couple of features of what the benefits of management systems are. Certainly on the left, there are a collection of best practices. Management systems are developed collaboratively through various technical committees. Management systems provide guidance on what needs to be done or what shall be done based upon best practices. It really leaves the how up to the organization based on the context of the organization. They're adaptable to the context of the organization, and I think in a lot of instances, feedback we get from our client base is the value of transparency. So the audit and certification process, just demonstrating to a neutral third party that the organization has reached a certain level of best practices as a benchmark as it relates to information security and business continuity.
And by the way that we describe the context, or the standard describes the context of the organization, that's really the makeup of the organization or how that organization works. And each organization, as we all know, are different. So the context of the organization really is how the organization works.
And then what management systems are not, and we deal with this a lot when we start doing engagements with clients, they assume it's some kind of a regulatory framework, particularly in the information security business continuity space. The approach, because of some other frameworks that are out there, NIST, etc. Sometimes organizations assume it's a checklist of controls, particularly in the information security space. They assume that we're talking about technical solutions to technical problems. I think that the third bullet point is also very relevant in that standards, management system standards, don't define how something is done. And the easiest example I use here is when we're talking about passwords. There's no place in 27001 where it prescribes a particular length and complexity of a password. You basically are using the context of the organization to ensure that your information security program and business continuity program is appropriate given the context of the business. Not overspending, not underspending, not too much security or not too little security, and the same from a DRBCP standpoint, that the plans are fit for purpose. Some of the benefits, certainly the first one, governance, IT security, business continuity governance, aligning policies and procedures. It really, the fact that management system standards are risk-based helps an awful lot of organizations, making sure that expenditures for organizational resilience are appropriate to the size. The fact that they're risk-based, particularly in the security side, traditionally, I think a lot of IT security professionals spent their life chasing vulnerabilities, chasing weaknesses, and went back to the business side and tried to ask for budget and resources, maybe treating weaknesses that weren't appropriate for the organization. When I talk about this, I always give an example of my company's website. I've probably done in excess of 300 risk assessments in the last 10 years. We do this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I always ask how many people look at our website. To date, in about 12 years, I've had 11 people look at our website. Now, I'm sure at some level, from a technical standpoint, there are some vulnerabilities our website has in terms of configuration and hosting that an organization like eBay that does $17 billion of revenue a quarter, we share some technical vulnerabilities, but from a return on investment, if I have 11 people look at my website in 12 years, I'm not going to really spend a lot of money addressing vulnerabilities or weaknesses, whereas a larger organization like an eBay would certainly spend a fair amount of money to make sure that the attributes of confidentiality, availability, integrity, and availability are well protected for their organization. So companies that we've worked with that have implemented management system standards have really found it useful to quantify when it's appropriate to expend resources, time, people, and money on security and continuity, again, because of the context of the business and the integration of risk and risk appetite. And some other, bullet points. Certainly the two that are bolded, management systems can be used to help demonstrate regulatory compliance based upon best practices. We'll talk about that later on the presentation. Transparency, a lot of times, playing both ways. We've had feedback from a lot of customers that the fact that they can look at their clients and demonstrate that from a security and continuity standpoint, that their practices, controls, processes, and plans have met the rigor of international best practices, and that a third party is basically certified and attested to that, certainly is meaningful externally. Also internally, I've had a lot of clients give us feedback that compliance for company employees tends to increase in that if you've got a publicly facing badge that demonstrates that you were certified to ISO 27001 for security or ISO 22301 for business continuity, lack of compliance with the requirements could potentially lead to suspension or revocation of your certification. And the threat of that alone, it's one thing not to have the badge that's publicly facing, but all of a sudden the question being asked as to what happened, why did you lose the certification, goes an awful long way internally to get people to comply with attending training, maintaining compliance to appropriate security controls, testing of DR plans, BCP plans, etc. And I think for this audience, finally, and we'll show this, management system standards can be used to align well to the 12 domains of the ICOR organizational resiliency framework. So just a very quick overview of ISO 27001, 2013. It's really about the protection of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of organizational information assets, infrastructure information. It really forces you to look at processes and controls to protect these three attributes in a holistic fashion. Confidentiality primarily dealing with the disclosure, non-disclosure information. Integrity being right data, right place, right time. And availability really cross over to the BCP space. Are the resources available as they're needed? So about ISO 27001, the standard specifies the requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving information security management system within the context of the organization. And that last piece of the first sentence is very important. It's not a checklist that says you have to implement the following 114 things. It defines processes that you basically tell a story in the organization about what you have to protect, why you're protecting it. The best practices really say what should be in place, but the how is up to the organization based upon risk appetite, compliance requirements, and a couple of variables. I think another piece of the value is the last sentence of 27001, that it's really intended to be scalable. Some of the other framework that we have worked with tend to be more of a checklist approach. You can end up spending too much time, too many resources, and implement so many security controls that it impacts the business in a negative fashion. 27001 does a great job to make sure that you've got an appropriate size security program that is actually an asset, that you become an asset to the business. You're a business enabler and not basically the organization that keeps on saying no and shuts the business down. just very quickly what 27,000 looks like from a structure standpoint. It's divided into two parts. The first part, we're really focused on clauses 4 through 10. That's referred to as the management system. You can see all of the process requirements that are defined in those clauses, defining context of the organization, leadership for information security management, planning support, operations, performance evaluation, continuum improvements. And then the second part is comprised of 114 controls that really are written for what should be in place based upon the best practices, how something is implemented, and getting back to my example earlier of how complex a password is, what are the attributes, and what's the life of the password, are really up to the organization based upon risk appetite and compliance requirements. So under 27,001, it doesn't say that you have to implement all 114 controls. Based upon the context of the business, you have to address them. Most organizations we've worked with end up implementing somewhere around 90 to 95 of the controls and are able to exclude 20 or 25 of the controls based upon how the management system is scoped and the context of the business. So with regards to really the benefit, the purpose, and what an auditor is looking for at certification is evidence that an organization is establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system in the context of the organization. Some of the benefits to following this approach are certainly documented processes, implementing processes that are sustainable and comparable. Back to my comments earlier about particularly compliance internally, the fact that you've got to demonstrate, monitor, review, and continual improvement does an awful lot to make sure that whatever processes and controls are implemented from a security standpoint has some staying power. So it's very much to achieve certification and most importantly maintain certification. The organization is going to demonstrate all of these attributes around monitor, review, and continually improve the management system itself and the associated controls. 27,001 also forces you to take a holistic view of information security controls. A lot of times, those folks that are very technical in this space tend to think strictly about technical problems and technical solutions. A lot of it times when we start working with the clients, these days, most organizations, not all, have the technical basics in place. The low-hanging fruit tends to be around administrative controls that really affect user behavior and the culture of security. So the standard based upon the domains, which I'll show you in a minute, really make you think about physical, technical, administrative controls to deal with information in any form, verbal, electronic, or written. This is just an overview briefly of the control domains. Recall there were 14 control domains and 114 controls distributed throughout the control domains. The numbers in each one of the little octagons there summarizes the controls that are in each of the domains. And as you look from the left over to the right, you can see certainly examples of administrative controls, information security policy, human resources, down the middle, physical controls as it relates to physical and environmental security. Looking over to the left, information security aspects of business continuity, a bit of a crossover from just more the traditional focus on protection of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it really does force you to take a look at information security controls and management processes holistically and really focuses on technical, physical, administrative controls.
We'll talk a little bit about ISO 22301. We as an industry have looked far and wide and for a long time for a standard that we could hang our hat on. And we've had in the past, we've had a number of guidance documents, NFPA 1600 and such, but ISO 22301 really establishes now a very solid framework for which we can then build out plans. And again, this standard specifies the requirements to plan, establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain. A lot of the things that we saw in the 27001 document or 27001 description, applies here. The same verbiage, the same type of requirements. With 22301, they're purposely intended to be generic so that they can be applicable to all kinds of organizations across many different industries. So it doesn't have to. It's not a standard that applies to Fortune 100 or Fortune 50. This applies to organizations of all sizes. And in fact, we've worked with small clients that want to become ISO 22301 certified in order to satisfy some internal requirement or even an external requirement. So again, similar to what we saw in 27001, the scope, references, and terms pretty much the same. The meat of 22301 is clauses 4 through 10. The context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operations, and so on and so forth. And if you were to think about how your business continuity and disaster recovery plans are made now, you've got components of these clauses in there. What 22301 does is it hangs a really neat organization to putting your plans and your program together. You may find that if you are an ISO certified organization, that you're asked to demonstrate 22301 certification at some point in the future. So this gives you a clear roadmap to do that. So it requires, thanks, Mike. It requires us to plan, establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain, and continually improve. And we as business continuity professionals know that it's not a one and done type of project or program. So we've got to get into this continual improvement mode, and 22301 gives us a really neat framework to help do that. So we've got to operate it, we've got to monitor it, we've got to review it, and then continuously improve the business continuity management system. So what is it? What is this business continuity management system? We're all familiar with this graphic that's on the screen now, where you've had an event and you get into your emergency response phase, and you move into your crisis management, business and IT restoration, normalization phases, and then finally down to salvage and recovery. What the BCMS does is it helps establish this foundation and these activities that will help govern the program against any adverse impact from the time of incident or the time of disaster all the way through, when we go back and we resume normal business operations. So it's kind of a step-by-step process that helps to organize and put the programs in a very logical manner. So areas within the BCMS are the emergency response plan, the IT disaster recovery plan that covers technology, system data, infrastructure, and so on, the crisis management plan, and the business continuity plan that is really focused on business process, supporting requirements, and so on and so forth. And there's a point where, depending on the event, integration of all plans is possible. And I would bet that for some of you, you've seen that, where you've had a disaster, a technology disaster that kicks over and affects business continuity, crisis management, and maybe even emergency response. So these are the key deliverables within 22301 and the business continuity management system.
So interestingly enough, as we went through the two management systems, the management systems themselves, 4 through 10, are very similar. This provides a mapping of basically the essence of integrating both of these management systems from a governance and risk management standpoint. You can use the same processes to manage both your IT security for your organization and business continuity. So it becomes a nice way to leverage a single process, a single governance framework to make sure that you're continuing to monitor, review, and improve information security and business continuity. And again, back to the value of certification, more often than not, we hear from customers that the fact that they've got this publicly facing badge that says they're certified to these two standards really helps to make sure that people comply with information security controls and things like resources to do business continuity, DR tests, training, plan updates, that type of thing. It really helps avoid what we see a lot, a consulting organization come in the DRBCP space, go for a big project, put together a book that gets stuck on a shelf and nobody reads for 5 years. So there really is some value in implementing the management system, developing the synergies between security, continuity, and DR to enhance organizational resilience, and then using these processes to make sure that everybody stays honest from a compliance standpoint and to make sure that your controls, plans, tests, and training are relevant and up to date. This is just another analysis of the BCMS methodology. All of these standards are based upon Plan, Do, Check, Act. And this gives you a view of specifically where there are process synergies between ISO 27001 and 22301. So implementing these standards, getting them certified, does an awful lot to provide transparency, which is very meaningful to external parties like clients and regulators, customers, clients, regulators, and at the same time certainly does help provide an easy way for you to implement, monitor, review, and continually improve good practices and good controls around information security, business continuity, disaster recovery, which are some of the key attributes of the organization resilience framework. So just to give a little bit more of an overview of how this aligns to the ICOR organization resiliency framework, you can see that we took the 12 domains and just looked at from a very high level specific clauses of both of the standards. Again, 27001 Information Security Management System and 22301 Business Continuity Management System, how the implementation of these two standards will help you ensure processes and controls specifically mapping back to the organizational resiliency framework.
Correct. And this is really where as we talked about some of the synergies, but this is really important. I've seen this get board level attention, and when you can map the two together, and especially with the ICOR organizational resilience framework, all that much better.
And the fact that, again, it's certification, you've gone through the rigor of a third-party audit, there is a level of transparency to demonstrate that you have implemented best practices. You can demonstrate compliance to both regulatory issues and also best practices. So I'll talk briefly now about how you can use management system standards to demonstrate compliance to GDPR. A little background, the European Union General Data Protection Regulation compliance deadline is May 25th, 2018. The regulation was published in April 2016 with a 2-year ramp up for organizations to become compliant. A couple of just quick definitions. GDPR defines the requirement to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons, in particular, their right to the protection of personal data. The regulation itself defines 179 recitals and 99 articles around the protection of rights and freedoms for natural persons as it relates to their personal data. One of the concerns, or I guess a couple of concerns, first of all, breaches of GDPR can be penalized by up to 20 million euro, and given the exchange rate now with the US dollar, that's real money, and or up to 4% of global revenue. Do we have another poll question, Linda?
We do.
Okay.
So the question is, how will GDPR affect your organization? We'll give you a couple more seconds to think about it. For many of you, this might be something that you have that you're not familiar with, and so you might not really be sure. And if your organization works internationally, it is something that you're going to want to consider. One question, Michael, how does GDPR affect if you're only a U.S. company? There aren't that many companies anymore that are only U.S., but just curious.
So there are several articles 1 and 2, that talk about jurisdiction. And the short of it is, if you provide goods and or services, whether they're paid for or not, within the EU, chances are you've got to comply. Some Some of the regulation language around jurisdiction are open to interpretation, but the language really speaks to, it's not just EU citizens, it's people who reside in the EU and people who work in the EU on a temporary work visa. So there's a couple of things I'll talk about in a few minutes where it's a bit concerning right now because the interpretation is very broad. And I'll walk through some of these definitions in a few minutes once we're done with the poll.
Well, it looks like about 50% of the people believe it'll impact them substantially or moderately, and then another 30-some% that aren't sure or not at all, with the remaining being in the middle. So it sounds like this is something that will affect most people that are at least here today.
On people's minds. Yeah. It certainly seems to be an area of concern with virtually everybody we're dealing with, particularly as it relates to scope, material scope, and jurisdiction. There's some language in those two articles that are open to interpretation. So we've been really trying to simplify it for folks that we're dealing with, organizations we're dealing with. The guideline really is if you provide services at all to anybody within the EU, chances are you have to be compliant. And there are some more interpretations around how material the scope of processing of personal data is, really questions for attorneys and general counsels to figure out, but just a couple of guidelines. So, key definitions. One, the material scope and territorial scope is very concerning. Secondly, I think I want to point out how the EU defines personal data as part of GDPR. In the U.S., we tend to think of PII or PHII as some set of data, name and social security number, name, address, name, date of birth, that type of thing. If you look at this definition, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just the highlighted language, personal data means any information relating to an identified or identified natural person, as it is referred to in GDPR, a data subject. So as I've gone through the last 6 or 8 months sort of collecting facts, as we're coming up to the deadline now where compliance becomes an issue, personal data can be your name, your address, your email address, your IP address, a MAC address, whether the information is public or private. Under this regulation, it's considered personal information. So that's point one that's concerning, in addition to what the scope is, and then processing. So we tend to, in this country, IT professionals, when you talk about processing, store transmit processing is typically what we speak to. I'll spend a second on this definition. According to Article 4 of GDPR, processing means any operation or set of operations which is performed on personal data. And again, keep in mind, personal data is anything that can be used to identify a natural person or sets of personal data, whether or not by automated means. So keep in mind whether it's automated or not, such as collection. So as we talk with a lot of people about GDPR, stored, transmit, process, but a lot of organizations completely forget the intake point, collection, and tend to only think about personal data as a subset of a couple of attributes, not something identifiable, and they tend not to think about collection, whether it's verbal or written. And as you look at this, collection, recording, organization, structuring, storage, adaptation, alteration, retrieval, consultation, use, disclosure by transmission, dissemination, making available, etc., etc., etc. What's considered processing is very broad. So you've got a regulation with a very broad interpretation and jurisdiction, very, very broad interpretation as to what's personal data, and also a very broad interpretation or definition as to what is considered processing. In a lot of organizations we've talked to, the collection piece, particularly as it relates to something that's oral or something is written, is a bit confusing and tends to be overlooked. A couple of the key definitions. The regulation talks an awful lot about the responsibilities of the controller. Again, I'll focus in what's highlighted. A controller is really a person or organization that determines the process and means, the purposes, and means of processing of personal data. And then a processor is an organization that processes personal data on behalf of the controller. And per the regulation, a processor is supposed to only process data on behalf of the controller based upon written instructions. So most of the responsibility, accountability, and liability for breaches of GDPR lie on the controller, but part of what's required is the controller then has to provide written instructions to every single organization that processes personal data. So again, very, very broad in terms of what's the jurisdiction, very broad in terms of the interpretation of what's personal data, anything that can be used to identify a natural person, very broad with regard to what's considered processing, not overlooking the fact that collection, whether it's oral, written, or electronic, is important, and the accountabilities around the controller, a person in an organization that makes decisions about the purposes and means of processing, and then processors who process data on behalf of written instructions provided by a controller. So as you walk through some of this, and I want to give some context, but don't want to spend the entire time talking about GDPR, because I want to really show how you can use management systems to help demonstrate compliance. But as you start looking at, again, scope, type of what is considered personal data, responsibilities, and accountabilities, this is very broad. So in Article 24, there is language, and I'll point to specifically what's the second part, that the use of approved certification mechanisms, as referred to in a couple of articles, Articles 40 and 42, may be used as an element by which the controller can demonstrate compliance to its obligations under GDPR. So we're not by any means saying that you can be certified to GDPR, but specifically per Article 24, you can use certification mechanisms, and specifically as it relates to the requirements around security and processing, ISO 22301 and 27001. Article 32 defines the requirements around security of processing, and as you go through the 99 articles and 179 recitals, there are many places where it speaks to the use of either a code of practice or certification mechanisms to help demonstrate compliance to the organizational and technical requirements under GDPR. And again, some of the language that's highlighted, control and processors shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. And you think about the management system itself, clauses 4 through 10 of both standards, Annex A controls in 27001, technical, physical, administrative controls, and then all the planning requirements around DR, crisis management, business continuity management, etc. in 22301. This really does help fulfill the requirements under Article 32 as you look at some of the highlighted language, the ability to ensure ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of processing systems and services. Item C there, to restore the availability, and item D, regular testing, assessing, and evaluating. So a lot of, again, what's required around establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, and continually improve really does address the requirements in Article 32. Now, the requirements around the use of organizational and technical measures are dispersed throughout many areas in GDPR. There are some breach notification requirements. There are also some recommendations on the use of encryption that would be dealt with by 27001 and 22301. The intent wasn't to spend an hour to talk about the 99 articles, but it's really to help everybody understand how the use of management system standards can help demonstrate, and I can't underscore enough, demonstrate compliance to GDPR. This is not a GDPR certification, but it's using certification mechanisms to demonstrate compliance. So the approach that we've developed to look at this, because it is a regulation, is to really work with general counsel, outside counsel, within organizations to interpret certain aspects of GDPR. I'm sure some folks are familiar with things like lawfulness of processing, requirements around consent, requirements around establishing a main location in the EU for non-EU companies, things like a data protection officer, and some other things around accountabilities. There are some interpretations that we want to work with counsel on to define what needs to be done, and then utilizing a set of standards I'll show in the next slide, basically aligning the processes required in these standards to deal with the organizational controls, and then the Annex A controls and the planning mechanisms under 22301 to address the technical considerations or technical measures of GDPR. So we've developed a framework that's based upon 4 standards, 2 of them which are certifiable, shown on the left, ISO 27001, and I won't read through all the summaries, but we've just provided a quick overview as to 27001, 22301, specifically what they address. They are certifiable by third parties and really demonstrate best practices around the protection of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resiliency. From a privacy standpoint, there is not yet a global certifiable standard on privacy. British Standard 112 was actually initially published in 2009 to address some of the requirements to demonstrate best practices for some of the requirements around the EU Data Directive, which is the prior regulatory framework before EU GDPR. It was updated last March and really is useful to align ISO 27001, which is information security management, with the privacy requirements, and it helps establish a personal information management system that basically is bolted on to 27001 to ensure that data privacy and security of personal data is integrated into the management system. That is not a certifiable standard, it's a guideline. There's also ISO 27018, which is privacy for cloud providers, which could be a consideration here depending on the organization. And then the final framework is EU-US Privacy Shield. That is a self-certification through the Department of Commerce that provides non-EU entities the ability to do what's referred to as cross-border cross-border processing, so that EU private data can be moved from non-EU member countries into the U.S. and we still have adequate protection around really rights of individuals to understand how their data is being collected, how it's being processed, how it's being used, and some other things around consent, right for rectification, right to be forgotten, etc. So 2 of the standards on the left, 27001, 22301, well recognized globally. Certainly a lot of uptick in this country over the last 5 years with adoption and certification, one because of global best practices, and secondly because of the transparency of third-party certification.
Right, exactly right. So, and we've seen, especially 22301 get more and more traction, and I think it's going to become, I'll say the gold standard moving forward, because again, it gives you that very logical framework that that ties in neatly with 27001.
So on the left, 2 certifiable standards specifically mentioned in Article 24 of GDPR, again to demonstrate, and I can't underscore enough the word demonstrate compliance, not certified to. You can't be certified to this regulation, but you can use the certification mechanisms to demonstrate compliance to organizational technical measures. Coming over to the right, although BS 112 is not a certifiable standard, it is a globally recognized best practices around the management of private information. And then finally, EU-US Privacy Shield, which, depending on which way the wind is blowing, we may continue to support or not continue to support, but at least it's a ready-made solution that does provide adequacy so that in the event that cross-border processing of personal data is required, organizations can stipulate that they've got the appropriate protections in place. So I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. What we've done is summarized really Articles 3 through 49 of GDPR, which mostly speak to the responsibilities of processors and controllers. Some of the higher number articles, 50 and beyond, mainly speak to the responsibility of the supervising authority. Those are governmental agencies within each member state that are responsible to ensure compliance. But as you look through to the right, over to the left, you can see the article. In the center, what the article is concerned about. And then finally, EU-US Privacy Shield, which, depending on which way the wind is blowing, we may continue to support or not continue to support, but at least it's a ready-made solution that in the event that cross-border processing of personal data is required, organizations can stipulate that they've got the appropriate protections in place. So I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. What we've done is summarized really Articles 3 through 49 of GDPR, which mostly speak to the responsibilities of processors and controllers. Some of the higher number articles, 50 and beyond, mainly speak to the responsibility of the supervising authority. But as you look through to the right, you can, over to the left, you can see the article. In the center, in following what we showed earlier, legal, organization, and technical measures, as you look down the right, you can see any place where it says technical, record, policy, procedure, notification, role, and responsibility. Through the 4 standards that we defined, you will have coverage and will be able to demonstrate compliance to these specific articles. And again, just another shot as it looks through Article 18 through 32, just an example of what type of coverage you'll be provided to be able to demonstrate compliance to the requirements of GDPR by implementing 2, 3, or 4 parts of the framework as discussed. In the framework that we proposed, the 4 components, 27001, 22301, BS 112, EU US Privacy Shield, we're not recommending that all organizations implement all parts of the framework. There are certain legal ramifications that really should receive advice of counsel to figure out whether 1, 2, or 3, or all 4 parts of that framework make sense. But these are well-recognized standards as shown here that map back to at least helping organizations demonstrate compliance. Everything I've read, all the facts that I collect, and a lot of language in EU GDPR does speak to those organizations that can show a reasonable effort to demonstrate compliance and are cooperative with regards to reporting breaches to both the supervising authorities and data subjects, natural persons, and are helpful with after-action reviews, breach notification, incident post-mortem, et cetera, have good defined processes and are cooperative, will actually, in the event of a breach, any potential fine will be significantly less than those organizations that have made no efforts to demonstrate compliance and are not cooperative after the fact once the milk is spilled with regards to reporting the breaches as required to the supervising authority and data subjects. So again, this is not a certification. You implement the stuff and 100% guarantee that you're going to demonstrate compliance. But because this is a new regulation, it's been floating around for about 2 years. Enforcement starts the 25th of May. Certainly something is better than nothing. So implementing these standards rather than wait, and I've talked to a lot of organizations where the advice given them by XL Counsel is, let's wait and see. Let's wait for a breach. The assumption is that the organizations that the EU tends not to like, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., credit reporting agencies will probably be the first candidates for enforcement action. So depending on what industry you're in and the size of your organization, the belief is if you treat your data subjects well, you're clear about the purpose of processing, how they establish consent, their ability to know what the information is used for, rectification, the right to be forgotten. If you manage those parts well, depending on the size of your organization and what industry you're in, chances are you may not have to worry about this stuff. And I can't underscore May of next year.
Right. But those fines are hefty.
The fines are enormous, and I think the ability to demonstrate that you've taken reasonable measures to try to comply, instead of just sort of rolling the dice and waiting to see how interpretations are made, either through regulatory fines, investigations, etc., that at least having these things in place, as these slides demonstrate, will at least show that you've made reasonable efforts to comply with GDPR. So we've developed a GDPR compliance assessment tool. It looks at the 3 categories: legal regulatory compliance, organization and technical measures. I had mentioned to Linda, anybody who's interested would be happy to provide a copy of that to any attendees at no charge. It may be helpful to have organizations take a look at what the concerns are, identify gaps, and at least help develop a roadmap so you can demonstrate compliance to GDPR. All right, last thing, we're running up to the end of the hour. We've got about 11 more minutes left. Much the same logic. New York DFS, Department of Financial Services, Cybersecurity regulation. There are several dates where compliance becomes important. A couple of milestones coming February and March of this year. I guess before I get into the meat, Linda, we have another polling question.
We do. So if you could answer the question, will the NYDFS cybersecurity requirements impact you with the same options? Looks like people are voting pretty quickly, and it looks like a lot of people aren't familiar with these requirements. So I think it'll be a good thing for you to be sharing. I'm going to go ahead and give you about 3 more seconds. People are still voting, so I'm not hanging it up yet. Okay. So what's really interesting is that there's more than half the people are not sure on how it's going to impact them, with 10% thinking substantially and 28% thinking moderately. So here's a real different comparison from what you said with the previous poll, where more people thought that they would be impacted, or we have more people here on this one not being sure.
So the consideration really here is New York State implemented this regulation. Again, dates, compliance dates coming through. The first round of compliance reporting, February 2018. More dates as we move through 2018. What's important to look at, and potentially why 10% are very concerned about it, and a much smaller percentage not so concerned as related to GDPR, is the DFS cybersecurity requirements break down compliance into 2 areas, very similar to some of the rationale you see in HIPAA. It defines covered entities. You can look at the definition there. Covered entity means any person operating under or required to operate under a license, registration, charter, certificate, permit, accreditation, or similar authorization under the banking law, the insurance law, or financial services law. So it really speaks to covered entities being those organizations that are considered financial services. I think the area where there's perhaps more gray as you look at the third-party requirements. So back to the top of the screen, a covered entity is required to comply with all aspects of NYDFS. There were defined requirements in clause 500.11, 12, and 15 with third-party entities, and those are really suppliers, part of the supply chain to financial services companies that are required to comply. Very similar, and again, not to walk through this, but as you take a look at the left, these are actually the clauses in New York DFS. And this is an example of how, if you've implemented ISO 27001 through the various clauses and the various Annex A controls, how the implementation of that management system helps support and again helps demonstrate compliance to the requirements of NYDFS. So again, this is not a certification to NYDFS, but if you've implemented things like an information security program, security policy, and various technical, administrative, and physical controls that are required to achieve certification to ISO 27001, you've covered virtually all of the aspects, the regulatory requirement aspects required under NYDFS cybersecurity regulations. So just 2 instances how we've looked at the implementation of the management system will help you with demonstrating compliance to regulations. We've talked a lot just in summary about how management system standards can help enhance organizational resilience. I think most importantly, management system standards provide a documented, sustainable, and comparable method to improve organizational resilience and drive continual improvement. And I think as practitioners, that last piece probably has the most value. This is a way to make sure that what we've implemented from a security management process and from the business continuity DR process and programs just isn't a once and done. The fact that you've got to have annual audits, annual reviews, you've got to continue to move the ball forward and demonstrate continual improvement does an awful lot to make sure that we don't just do something once in a vacuum, create some policies that could put on the shelf and just end up collecting dust. And I think finally, very meaningful as it relates to this organization, the mappings that we've demonstrated, ISO 22301, 27001, really do help ensure, based upon the 12 domains of the ICOR organizational resiliency framework, that these 2 management system standards help not only enhance that, but really through the certification audit process, validate that you've got strong processes, procedures, and controls to ensure organizational resilience. And that's it. Thank you all for your time. Are there any questions we can answer in the next couple of minutes?
Sorry, I was busy talking on mute, so that was pretty helpful.
Okay.
If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the question tab, and we'll go ahead and answer those. And Michael, if you could just go to the final slide. I just wanted to let you know we have one final webinar coming up. It's about supply chain. So please go ahead and sign up for that if you're interested. This presentation will be available by the end of the week on the ICOR website. If you go to the webinar page and just scroll down, you'll be able to view this webinar as well as any of the other webinars for this year. We also have a YouTube channel where you can view the past webinars as well. You'll be getting a survey that'll come out shortly. If you could please fill out the survey, they really help us to plan and to do continual improvement as well. And we will be sending out a survey to all of our attendees of the webinars this year, asking you about webinar topics for next year as we plan to start our series again at the end of January. So without seeing any questions, I'd like to thank both Michael and Mike for presenting with us tonight. Oh, hang on, I do see a question come in. Give me 1 second. The question says, can you overview ISO certification for 22301? Is that a question you want to answer, Michael?
Sure, it's Mike. Sure, it's Mike Johnson. So the certification requirements for both 27001 and 22301 are very similar. In order to get certified, you have to go through a series of 3 mandatory audits and 1 optional audit. Under both management system standards, you have to conduct an internal audit. Initially, you'll go through all the clauses 4 through 10 defining the requirements for the management system itself. Under 27001, you'll then do control sampling of the technical, physical, administrative controls. Very similar for 22301. You'll go through the management system requirements around establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, and continually improve, and then walk through the risk assessment process, business impact analysis, DR planning, BCP planning, and testing and training.
And strategy selection as well.
And strategy selection. So you're required to do an internal audit. An internal auditor is somebody, can be either an internal or external resource. The 2 basic requirements are you can audit your own work, and the auditor has got to have some formal training in the 2 standards, and specifically management system standards. Beyond that...
And I think, Michael, what that ties to is Mark's other question, which is how about individuals getting certified? And I'll just go ahead and do some what I call blatant marketing there. There are different organizations that provide certifications for individuals. ICOR has the Implementing ISO 22301 course that you can take the ISO 22301 Lead Implementer exam, certification exam for, either as part of the course or you can take the exam separately. We also have our ANSI accredited Lead Auditor course that you can take that as well to earn that credential. We also had a question about the assessment tool, and just to remind you that we will send out the assessment tool. So sometime in the next week, you will receive a certificate of attendance from us for attending the webinar, and as part of that, we will also send you a copy of the assessment tool. Hopefully that answers all the questions you guys had. We are at 12:58. Did you have any other comments before we close?
No, I think we're good, Linda. Thank you very much, and thanks to those that dialed in today. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.